All right, so here we are reading about the Quartering Act. And the Quartering Act is another indirect tax issued by Parliament in 1765. So we've got a series of events that all start happening really fast. Things are starting to move really quickly now. During the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War as it was more commonly known in the colonies, British military commanders in North America often found it difficult to persuade the assemblies of some uncooperative colonies to pay for the housing and provisioning of the soldiers sent over to fight the French. Once the war had ended, the king's advisors decided that some British troops should remain in North America, in theory, to defend the colonies. Since the war had left Britain with a large national debt, it also was especially important that the colonies should pay their share of the costs of keeping these men in the American colonies. Contrary to popular belief, the Quartering Act of 1765 did not require that colonists bring soldiers into their private homes. But this next part is very important. The act did require colonial governments to pay and provide for feeding and sheltering of any troops stationed in their colony. So if London decided to put thousands of troops in your colony, all of a sudden your taxes are going to be used to pay for them. What's different about that and shoving them in my own home? If enough barracks were not made available, the soldiers could be housed in inns, stables, outbuildings, uninhabited houses, or private homes that sold wine or alcohol. Meaning, if you had a summer home and you weren't residing there, they could just take it and use it to house soldiers. But it also could be that uninhabited old janky cabin that nobody's lived in for 20 years. They could get housed in there too. The act did not provoke widespread or violent opposition, partly because significant numbers of British troops were stationed in only a few colonies, and also because most colonies managed to evade fully complying with its provisions. The colonies got sneaky with how they did this. They didn't want to pay for it, so they came up with ways to delay it, to do anything other than paying for it. It's just, you want to get sneaky with how you tax us? We'll get sneaky in how we avoid paying our taxes. To a certain extent, the act was overshadowed by the response to the Stamp Act, also passed in the same year, just a little earlier. People were already freaking out over the Stamp Act, so the Quartering Act, while it made a lot of people really angry, it only really angered people living in colonies that had a lot of soldiers in them, which would be places like Virginia and Massachusetts. Just so happens that's where the revolution really gets started, is in Massachusetts. I wonder why. Nevertheless, many American colonists saw the Quartering Act as one more way Parliament was attempting to tax them without their consent. Others suspected that the real purpose of keeping a small standing army in America stationed in coastal cities, not on the frontier where Native Americans were, was not for defense, but to enforce new British policies and taxes. You can pay for this army, or we'll use this army against you. The Quartering Act did become a divisive issue in 1766, however, after 1,500 British soldiers disembarked from New York City. The New York Provincial Assembly refused to provide funds to cover the costs of feeding and housing these men as required by the law. In response, the British Parliament voted to suspend the Provincial Assembly until it complied with the act. You don't want to obey our laws? Then your little government you got in New York goes away. Do you like being able to vote for your local government? Do you like your local government existing? Then do what Papa England tells you what to do. As it turned out, the suspension was never put into effect, since the New York Assembly later agreed to allocate revenue to cover some of the costs of quartering these troops. The Quartering Act of 1765 was largely circumvented, people largely got around it, by most of the colonies during the years before the Revolution. But Quartering Act, when you combine it with the Stamp Act, contributed to rising tensions and added to the anger and the violence that people were exerting, especially in organizations such as the Sons of Liberty. And eventually, this kind of stuff is going to lead to an all-out war, the Revolutionary War.